Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, HR Analytics. Our presenter today is Melissa Asher, the Director of Training and Development and Talent Acquisition here at CPS HR Consulting. All attendees are in listen-only mode to avoid interruptions to the session. If you have questions, please submit them through the questions panel in your webinar dashboard. We'll make every effort to address them at the end of the presentation as time allows. Today's presentation is available on the CPS HR website as a handout, and as a handout in your webinar dashboard. We'll also forward a link to the recording and slide deck to all of today's attendees as soon as it's available. And now, let's get started.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this exciting topic, HR Analytics. So one of the things you have to know about me before we get started is that I love spreadsheets. My husband and my family tease me because I kind of count accounting as a hobby. So I hope that it's not portraying me in a way that's not warm and fuzzy as well, but I really am drawn to the numbers. And so in my HR work, in both the training and the recruiting area, I have been increasingly more interested in the analytics of it, the evidence-based types of philosophies, so that when we're making our decisions in HR, we are making them a little bit more based around things that are statistical, or we're using more analysis. So that's just a little bit about why I'm here today, to share some of the insights that we've learned, that we've gleaned from the work that we do here at CPS and the work we do with our public sector clients. So how about you? What brought you here today? And I want you to use your question and answer screen. Put in a little chat, what is it about this topic? Do you love spreadsheets too? Are we kindred spirits? What brought you here to this webinar today?
And please go ahead and enter that into your questions panel. I've got someone saying, I love spreadsheets and data. Anyone else? Oh, they're coming in pretty fast. Here we go. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Need to measure to improve. Love spreadsheets, love spreadsheets, love spreadsheets.
My people, these are my people, Julie.
We've got data is awesome.
Okay, good.
Learn about the subject. So many people love spreadsheets.
Okay.
That is far and away the overriding theme here.
All right. Well, by the end, I've got a bonus YouTube I'm going to show you all for Power BI, which will be your next best friend compared to spreadsheets. So perfect, great. Well, thank you for joining us today. We are going to travel through 5 different areas in our agenda. We're going to talk just a little bit about what analytics, what does that mean anyway? What do we mean when we say analytics? Why is this important for HR, and why now? How do we get started using more analytics? We're going to take a little bit of a trip into analyzing data. We're not going to go too deeply because we only have about an hour today. And lastly, we'll talk a little bit about presenting findings. So try to wrap this whole topic up in a nice, neat bow. Okay, so when we talk about analytics, what do we mean anyway? Analytics really is putting together 2 concepts, analysis and statistics. That's the genesis of this lovely word for us, analytics. But how do we break that down? Really, what this means are really 3 concepts. And it starts with data, metrics next, and then analytics. So data is really the set of numbers or calculations that are gathered. You can think of them as the raw numbers that you collect and you track, and then they are typically used to generate or sustain some sort of performance metric. The metrics are, what are the performance measures that are important for us to track. Metrics take that simple data point that's captured, usually in the past or maybe in real time, and now present it in a way so that important performance indicators can be tracked and monitored so that we can make decisions. And analytics is where we're looking at the relationship across metrics, so multiple data points feeding into metrics. We're looking at those relationships in order to detect patterns and hopefully make better decisions or predict future performance based on those patterns and trends that we're seeing. Analytics does heavily use statistics to help see the patterns in the data. It's really a way to help us improve the link between the management of human resources and the business outcomes. That's how we want to try to use metrics in HR. How can we improve the outcomes for what we're providing with our services and our products by understanding more of the data around how we're managing our human resources. Here's the deal. You can't pick your data, right? There's lots of data points out there, but you must absolutely pick your metrics because that gives you the focus to be able to apply the analytics in the areas that really matter for what you're doing. So that's just a kind of a quick way to think about these three terms and how they relate and interact. So let me give you a little bit of a story about analytics. There was a nonprofit organization, and they created a video. It was a YouTube video, used some celebrities, and this particular nonprofit was all about getting people to donate used sports equipment to youth in need. So they thought, what a better way to do this? We'll have this cool video. They put time and effort into it. It was wonderful. They put it out there on YouTube. They got 1.5 million hits on that video, and they were thrilled. They thought, oh my gosh, this is success. We've built awareness, like this is exactly what we wanted to do, 1.5 million hits. But when they dialed back a little bit and dug a little bit into the data, what they found is from those 1.5 million viewers, only 8 viewers had actually signed up to donate equipment, and 0 people had actually donated equipment. So when you got down to the business outcome side, that campaign was actually a failure. So knowing what metrics to make the impact in your business to improve those outcomes, that's a very important piece of this particular puzzle. They were measuring video hits when really the metric should have been the donations, because when they really dialed down to it, that was not happening. So sometimes it's very easy to be concerned with the wrong metric. So that's why the analytics part is so important, the critical thinking through not only what are we measuring, how are we measuring it, but are we getting to those outcomes? So let's turn to an example that's from the HR world. So if we're thinking about turnover, there's a lot of data points for turnover. You know, how many people are leaving the organization? Maybe how many people are leaving a specific department? Is there a specific number of years? Are they leaving within 1 year? Or are they leaving within 5 years? Right? Lots of different data points that we might collect around turnover. So then the metric would be, and usually is, decreasing turnover. So what we want to do with that data is we want to see what are the patterns and what are the trends, because ultimately we want to see a decrease in turnover. And so then the analytics would be looking at all of those different data points. At what point are people leaving? What departments are people leaving? To what classifications, what job titles are leaving? Now we have some data that's going to help us drill down to a solution around something that's more granular. So maybe our problem isn't turnover in general. Maybe when we look at the data, we find that our turnover problem is in a specific department or it's with a specific classification. So that's, I'm hoping for you, a very tangible example of the HR metrics, what this means and what it can look like in your organization. It's really about that root cause, right? We're trying to get to the root cause of something. We're inundated with data. We have systems now that can collect all kinds of data, all kinds of data points. So by looking at those data points in more of a systematic way, by trying to connect more of those pieces, we can get to root causes so that ultimately we can get to an improvement opportunity. And here's another example of that. This is some work that we were involved with a large state department who conducted a customer service and quality survey in 2015. And they had a big discrepancy in their data, 2015, between their opinion of their services. They thought they were doing really an exceptional job delivering human resources services to the various departments that they were serving. But when they got the data back, they actually found that a fairly large percent, 27% said does not meet our client needs. Only 5% said they were exceeding their customer needs. This is quite surprising to them. So they started to dig a little deeper into why this was, what was going on, what were some of their processes, what were the complaints that they were seeing, that there was some pattern to, that there was, maybe more than one. They were seeing multiple, maybe complaints around timing, or maybe it was around follow-through, things like that. And they decided that they would change some of their programs, and they would change some of their processes. They would change the way that they were interacting. They would marshal their staff to talk about and devise better ways to communicate out to the department. And lo and behold, they came back in 2017 after they had implemented some of these changes and re-administered the survey, and we're very pleased with the result. Now, instead of 5% exceeding client needs, 21% survey said they were exceeding customer needs, and that does not meet was shrunk considerably down to 14%. So this is exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about HR analytics. Gathering the right data, using it to devise some new ways of doing a process, some new ways of interacting, whatever the case may be, making more evidence-based decisions in the way that we operate. So huge improvement there. And we've already kind of dipped our toe into this, but why is this important for HR? This is so terribly important for HR because HR sees the whole organization. HR really sits at a bird's eye seat across the whole organization. They can be an objective observer of these things to connect the dots. They're connected to the people, and the employees are the organization's most important asset. So if HR has this view into the people, the hiring, the longevity, the retention, the performance planning, the performance appraisals, if all of these data points can come together, and they do in HR, we're in a great place to impact those organizational outcomes. We're already working with departments, so we can help bring to light some of these people issues that a department may not know or see. They don't have the age demographics data, the exit interview data. So we might be able to proactively take some of these data points and then have a dialogue with the department about a challenge. Workforce planning is a perfect example of this. HR can get ahead of what's are the trends in terms of maybe how jobs are changing for the type of work that we're doing. And then they can work proactively with the department on some hiring strategies. HR really can be that business partner, so we can share in that credit for the results. Ultimately, it's all about achieving better outcomes for our employees and for those that we serve. So they're in a great spot to be able to understand the business and understand the people side, and to be kind of that canary in the coal mine, to be that alarm ringer when, hey, we're seeing some patterns here, we're seeing some trends in our recruiting, and we're seeing some trends in our retention data that we think we want to bring to everyone's attention, and then devise some strategies around that. So important place where we sit in HR. We have a lot of the data at our fingertips, and we can understand the people side of it and translate that out to our business folks who are really just focused on the operations side. Another thing HR can do is HR can make sure that we are staying aligned with our strategy, aligning the people metrics with the business strategy, and not letting the metrics take the place of the strategy. So this can be kind of dangerous sometimes, and we've got a little bit of a case study. Granted, this is private sector, but it's just such a great case study with Wells Fargo. So Wells Fargo, you'll recall, has been in the news over the last several years for really, fraudulent behavior, and they are reimagining kind of their operations and their strategy. But their strategy was, and actually it still is, building long-term customer relationships. Management was tracking the degree to which that was happening by measuring cross-selling. So the metric was cross-selling. That's what the attention was on. That's where the rewards were devised around. And that metric, that singular focus on, we got to sell more cross products, that completely overshadowed and actually replaced the strategy or the purpose, the outcome of what they were trying to do. It became all about opening accounts. So they opened 3.5 million accounts without customer consent. And the ultimate irony here is that metric drove a behavior which now has completely turned off customers to Wells Fargo. So they, in essence, did not build long-term customer relationships. They ended up having customers leaving in droves. So HR can be kind of, again, a bellwether to make sure that we are not running amok with our metrics, that the things we are measuring, the things we are looking at, the strategies we are devising still keep us true north to our purpose and to our outcomes. So that's just another interesting little real life story about how metrics are playing out in our world. It's about connecting the dots. At the end of the day, it's really about having HR help ensure that no one metric is driving unintended behaviors, and that the strategy and the outcomes are not getting lost. These things change over time. So they will differ depending on what the focus is and what the strategy is at any one time. Okay, so getting started. How do we get started with our metrics? It really starts with a problem. Getting very clear about what it is we are trying to solve or to impact. And that can be a little bit challenging sometimes because we like to get kind of caught up in symptoms. And we have a lot of people typically who are providing input into that. But what I would suggest in HR is looking at where people are complaining. what are they complaining about? And what kind of a business problem is that driving? What kind of challenges are we having? That's really the first place to start, really getting very clear on what is the problem, what is it that if we were to solve it would improve something, would make our jobs better, more efficient, more effective, what would help our constituents. So that's kind of the first step in using analytics is what is the problem that we're trying to solve. Because sometimes you'll find as you dig into the data, we have not defined the problem correctly. And you see this a lot with really recruiting and hiring and turnover, where a hypothesis might get thrown out that, oh, people are leaving because of the pay and the benefits. But when you dive a little deeper into that, you find that actually there's some other things going on when you start pulling in those other data points around things like exit interviews, things like an employee engagement survey. So we start with the problem. And then you have to plan what data is needed. What do we need to then get to a better understanding of that problem? So at first, it's really not about solving the problem. It's about getting a better understanding of what that problem is. So understanding maybe the goal. Do we have an understanding of the big picture? Do we really know what it is that we are trying to examine? Because that drives number two, understanding what types of data. Identifying, do we need to gather numbers? Is it really numerical types of things that we're gathering? Or do we need to do some focus groups and some surveying, which might give us more of a narrative side of this data? Very often you're going to want to look at both. What are the measurements that we're interested in? What are we already collecting? Because chances are you're already collecting a lot of data using your different sources. So what type of data do we need? What type of data do we have readily available? And what type of data do we need to create some sort of instrument to gather? Maybe that's as simple as a survey, or maybe that's pulling data out of an HRIS system, a Human Resources Information System, and doing some calculations. See, spreadsheets, I had to work spreadsheets into this, doing some sort of a pivot table to figure out what's going on with that data. That's the next step. And then how does that interact with the different HR functions? Is this all in, risk management? Are we really taking a deep dive into the workers' compensation data, trying to impact some safety programs so that we can get a better rate on our workers' compensation? What are the key HR functions? And as you know, in the HR world, the functions are related. They're connected. So very often you'll be looking in one, you'll be, for instance, maybe you're looking at this workers' compensation piece, but then you'll find that maybe there's a lack of training. So now and that training also may help with employees in terms of their job competence and their ability to feel like they know how to do their jobs better, and that maybe breeds better morale because you're now investing in them. So these things are very connected. And then you'll get together an initial hypothesis. So again, that might be something like people are leaving because of our pay and benefits. Our compensation is too low. That's the hypothesis. And now we're going to use the data that we're gathering. We're going to look across different HR functions, and we're going to now try to prove. It's almost like proving or disproving. So, but the goal is to solve a problem in the end. So that's just a little bit about the process for how to do it. And I want to share an example now of how to apply that. And we're going to use an example from employee engagement. So this is an example of some employee engagement survey data. At the far right-hand side is our Department 1. And the red 40% is not engaged, 40% is somewhat engaged, 20% is fully engaged in Department 1. All of the other bars there, private sector government, federal government, state, local government, are there, and public sector agency are there to kind of benchmark, right? So private sector government, federal, state government, and local. That gives us a snapshot of what's going on in aggregate in those particular sectors when they have been surveyed around employee engagement. Our public sector agency, which is second from the right, that's their aggregate data. So looking at their data for this particular agency, 40% of folks are fully engaged. Well, when you compare that to private sector engagement at 44%, that's pretty good. That's pretty comparable. When you compare that 40% to government in general at 38%, we're feeling really good about that number. And then you drill down in federal and state, even less than 40%. Local government is at 44%. But we're feeling, we're feeling pretty good about that because we're aligning pretty well with government as a whole and local government in general. But as I said, when I started looking at this slide, when we look at Department number 1, if we drill down into the public sector agency, that gives us a whole different picture. We were looking at the public sector agency data overall, we're feeling good. If we're looking at Department number 1, we probably have some concerns because only 20% of our folks are fully engaged and 80% are somewhat or not engaged at all. So that paints a completely different picture. Department 1 would have a very different strategy than something that we might have put together for the public agency as a whole, because that's a big difference. Now, if we look at yet another department now within this public sector agency, we have yet a third picture emerging. This particular department has 80% of folks that are fully engaged. Wow, what is going on in that particular department? This should just instantly, for all of my data folks out there, you should just be tingling with anticipation, right? We want to go and find out what is happening in Department number 2, because they don't need any kind of intervention. We need to figure out what is working so well there, and then using that information, devise some strategies that we can certainly look at possibly applying in Department number 1, but maybe even organizationally. So that truly is the process, the digging down, what data do we need to collect, and really thinking through now. With this, you want to go out and gather more data. You probably want to get some narrative data. You want to understand what's going on in Department number 2, so you can gradually move some of those successful practices into others. So I hope that gives you a good concrete illustration for how you might use data. The metric here obviously is increasing employee engagement. And what is the outcome there? Well, because we do know that engaged employees typically are happier, they're more productive, they are staying with the organization and giving that extra % effort. Okay, so we've talked a lot about now how do we identify a problem. That's the first step, coming up with kind of a hypothesis. We may or may not know if that hypothesis is true or not true, but that gives us the starting point to be able to gather data and to start looking at different points of data and then starting to apply some analytics. Why is this working in one department but not working in another department. So where do you find this data? You have a lot of data at your fingertips in HR. You've got your HR files, and hopefully a lot of those are computerized, but they may not be in all cases. So that does take a little extra work, but often then can be compiled into a spreadsheet or into a database of some sort. Certainly, you can track things like applications, how many applications are coming in. Of those applications that come in, how many are meeting minimum qualifications. That might give you a glimpse into how effective your job posting is. If you're getting a lot of applications and they're not meeting minimum qualifications, well, maybe there's something in that language that can be improved, because now you're wasting a lot of time looking at applicants who aren't meeting the minimum qualifications. Performance review data is another great source of data for HR. How are people doing? How is their performance? And that could tie into the financial systems, which might be your salary or benefits. Are people getting that, meeting expectations? Are they getting those annual salary increases? Or are you having a lot of issues? And are those issues happening in one particular area versus other areas? How are they comparing across departments? How are they comparing across supervisors? If you're lucky enough to have an HRIS system, NeoGov, Cornerstone, there's a ton of them out there. That's a great way for you to be able to pull data out, export data, and then apply some things like pivot tables, applying some of the statistical methods that we'll talk about in a little bit here. Lots of different sources. So you have to be a little bit creative sometimes. And what I would really recommend for HR folks is make sure you're tapping into those financial systems too, because there's a lot there that will help you in terms of, certainly if you're looking at compensation data, or if you're trying to determine if compensation is an issue, or benefits, different types of systems. So don't be afraid to reach out across and into other departments to gather data. Some of the common metrics, we won't spend a lot of time on this, but I just wanted to put this up, and someone prior to the webinar kind of asked, are there some common HR metrics? Well, yes, as a matter of fact, there are. And here's a list of some that undoubtedly you are probably collecting some of this data, maybe not all of it, but it's super helpful. So things like turnover, number of employees exiting during a given period, cost per hire, how much is this costing you to bring someone into the organization? You could do cost of turnover. I mean, this is somewhat related, when someone leaves, what does it cost to onboard someone, to get them to productivity? Another important data point, important measure. Time to fill, employee engagement. We've already talked a little bit about that. I brought up the example of workers' compensation costs per employee. A lot of good information in here that then starts leading you down that path of safety. What can we do to have a safer workplace? How does this then help us impact our insurance costs? So again, that's the intersection with your financial department to be able to improve the safety and to be able to spend less there so that you can redirect that resource to maybe a program. Training is another great place to gather lots of data. And I would encourage you not to gather just number of employees participating in training, but what is the applicability? How are they applying? If you have an emerging leaders program, promotions. How many folks going through that particular program are promoting? And age of retirement. Fabulous tool for workforce planning, right? How many people do we need to plan will be naturally, and congratulations to them, leaving our organization. But we will keep going, and we're going to have to get employees in to fill those particular roles. So Lots of different metrics, and here are just a few to whet your appetite, some of the bread and butter ones. This is how the age metric might play out. In this particular metric, what we see here is total number of employees, and then broken down by, are they age eligible to retire today, maybe retire in 5 years, in 10 years, you know, what are our total employees between a certain age number. And you'll see here my number of people that we've applied some analytics. Yes, applying a percentage to this makes it an analytic. Now you can use this data when you're talking to your stakeholders. You can make a very compelling case with your managers, with your management, like, oh my goodness, we need to really focus on some workforce planning because we've got a large percentage of people who are either eligible today, but within the next 5 years will be eligible. Significant percentage of people. So we want to start planning for that before they walk out the door. We want to make sure that we are getting on top of that, bringing in the right folks so that we have that continuity of our program. Okay, let's see here. All right, so this takes us to analyzing the data. All right, so if we are going to analyze the data, we have to use the S word, statistics. We will be looking at statistics. Statistics, can I say that? So here's my disclaimer. I am not an expert in statistics, but we're going to wade into the pool here today. We have a full day's class on HR analytics where we spend a significant amount of time diving into the statistics. We don't have time for that today, but we are going to take a little bit of a trip into statistics because it really is where the analytics start. And before we go into the actual statistics side of it, just a quick note about being very careful with accuracy and assumptions. So, and let me just take you back to when I was talking about the common metric, right? I had a common metric and I had a definition. Very important to define things because if I have one definition for a full-time employee, but you have a different definition for what a full-time employee is, then our data is not going to be accurate. We're going to have a mismatch and we might not even know it. So it's really important when you're getting into this to be very clear with any assumptions you're making and really stating your definition. So you want to avoid the ambiguity in the definition. You want to also make sure you're using credible sources. So I know Wikipedia comes up at the top of every search, but Wikipedia is not your most credible source because it is crowdsourced. Anyone can contribute to a Wikipedia, so be a little bit careful with that. And particularly in government, if we are pulling in studies, if we are really looking for data, we want to make sure that we're pulling that data in from very credible sources. And even something simple like writing a survey. Writing survey questions can be challenging. Sometimes you can write a survey question that is leading. And what I mean by that is it's written in a way that it takes the respondent down a certain path to answer one way versus another way. I'm going to give you an example. If we had a survey question, we were trying to, kind of get a temperature read of how people are feeling in the work environment, and we asked, do you have a problem with your boss? That question, is a little pointed, so I'll say that, but it's leading because you're already planting the idea in the person's head that there's some problems maybe with the supervisors here, or we're wondering, are there some problems going on with the boss, with the supervisors? You're already raising that prospect. A better way to say that would be, tell me about your relationship with your supervisor. Now we're going to get both of these, by the way, are narrative data sets, but now it's really open-ended. So we're seeking to ask questions in a way so it's not judgmental, There's less of an implication that maybe something is going on here. No, tell me about your relationship with your supervisor. Very, very open. You know, you want to capture data without casting kind of judgment. And then we do have to be aware of security, you know, personal data, employee privacy, as well as cost benefit. If it's going to take you $1 million to gather the data you need to answer your hypotheses, that's just not going to be feasible. So think about what is actually realistic. Okay, so working with data, you know, we're going to really talk about it in two different ways: qualitative data and then quantitative data. So qualitative data, think words, think narrative. And the basic step for that is you're gonna ask a question, you're gonna get narrative, word answers. So you're gonna start looking through, parsing through those answers, and you're gonna look for some things in this first step, kind of with the goal. It's just you're getting data that isn't lining up with what you're asking, because that might indicate whether or not you've had a leading question or something of that nature. So it's all kind of lining up with the goal of why we gather the data. Then you got to organize the data, and with qualitative data, that can be time consuming because you have to explore it, you have to sort through it, you have to apply critical thinking to identify themes. So this is very often used when you've got survey data and you've gotten like that question, you know, tell me about your relationship with your boss, with your supervisor. Okay, now I have to identify the themes across maybe 100 people responded, maybe 200 people responded. Gosh, I hope 1,000 people didn't respond, right? But you get the idea. You have to sort through it. You have to identify the theme. Did this come up once, or did this come up 10 times? Did it come up 20 times? You're looking for magnitude. And then you're analyzing. You were already down that road. You're analyzing it. Wow, this came up 50 times, and it came up in all different departments. Okay, now I can start drawing some conclusions around that. Basic process, very effective, and a good way to really draw out the themes, like to start seeing a pattern. Word clouds sometimes can do this for you. So we do this with some of our surveys. We did this recently with our risk management practitioner program and asked what we could do to improve it. And we got a bunch of data, you know, a bunch of narrative data that we dumped into a word cloud, which is a Google word cloud. There are lots of free applications. You can just dump text in. And what it does is it makes the words that occur most frequently bigger. So we can see right away from this that we've got some pretty good feedback. You know, what can we improve? They're already saying it's good and it's great, but time. So there's something about the timing. Maybe we need more time on a subject. Maybe we need less time on one of the subjects in the class. Subject, you know, courses. So maybe there's some other subjects, some other course material that we need to look in. So this gives you a quick snapshot, but then you have to dive in. Well, what are people saying about time? So now I can think about, oh, I need more time, I need less time based on this data. All right, so quantitative data. This is where we get to the numbers. And again, there's a lot we can cover here. We are going to kind of stick with the basics today. So first and foremost, you know, quantitative data, we're talking about data points. So you want to be kind of looking for missing data or maybe errors. If there's something that is like obviously pops out as an error, we're going to look for outlier data. We're going to check for the quality of our collection. Or maybe there's some other intervening variables going on that we didn't think about when we went out to collect this initial data. So the two types that we're going to talk about a little bit today fall into the category of descriptive statistics. So central tendency, you know, how the data is grouped together, and then we've got spread or variability and how different are the data points within the population. So if you're already thinking standard deviation on the second one, A+ out there. Central tendency. This is, again, pretty basic, but it's so fundamentally useful. We're talking about the mean, what is the average, we're talking about the median, What is the point with 50% of the data points above and 50% below? And the mode, what is the most frequently scored item? So this is really important data when we're looking at our HR data. Again, compensation data comes to mind. You know, here's an example of a spreadsheet, different classifications. We have the base salary for our city. We have the labor market median. So remember, that's the middle point of all of the markets that we've surveyed. And now we apply some percentages based upon that labor market, and we see that our accountant and our accountant assistant number 2 position, you know, are kind of significantly below market. So if we have had some complaints, if we are seeing a lot of attrition, a lot of turnover in the accountant series, this might be something that we would be concerned with. This might be a path that we would want to walk down a little bit further to see, wow, compensation could be a factor here. What are people saying in their exit interview data? So a good example, that apply that, you've got the mean and then the percentage applied to the mean. Variability is the difference within your population. So this is where we really get into things like standard deviation and range. So if you've ever heard of the bell curve, like the normal curve, we use this a lot in testing when we're looking at pass points to see how well a test may be performing. If we get an unusually shaped curve where there's very little variation and everybody is grouped together, everybody's scoring about the same thing, well, our test probably isn't doing what we need it to do because we need to differentiate between the candidates. So just a very quick note on that. Again, our class goes way into detail on this, more than we can possibly do today, and honestly more than I can keep straight in my head. All right, so kind of wrap this piece up. When you are applying these statistics, you're looking for patterns, you're looking for themes. You want to make sure if there are deviations that you can explain those deviations. When you're looking at the results, are they significant? Is it something that rises to the level of meaningfulness that we now want to maybe devise a plan around this? And I love the reality check. Does the data make sense? Stand back. Does it make sense? All right, well, we're going to round this out here with presenting the findings, because data is fabulous, spreadsheets are great, but if you can't explain those findings, you can't explain that data to someone, then chances are it's not going to be actionable. And we want your hard work in this analytic realm to be actionable. So what we're talking about here is know who you're presenting this data to and how they like that data to be presented. Is this going to be like a quick executive summary? What data is going to absolutely support maybe a position or a recommendation that this audience is going to be persuaded by, or is going to be compelled to take more of an interest or take an action? You know, how much time do you have? Can you create a bit of a story around that? I tried to do that with the slide on the employee engagement. Here we have a story. Oh, these numbers look great for the agency, but oh, when we drill down to this department, we've got a different story. In this department, yet a different story. So make it kind of interesting. People like there to be more to it than just the numbers. Don't go crazy with PowerPoint. And the point I want to focus the most on is how do you use some visualizations to bring your data to life. Of course, there's the traditional ones, which are charts and graphs. You know, we use these all the time. They can be very effective. I would just caution you to make sure that you are circling or somehow zeroing in or pulling out the points that are important to what you are presenting, so that it's not hard for someone to understand what they're looking at. Really draw the picture for them, and then just put a big old arrow if you want them to focus in on a particular point or on a particular country in this example. But these are great. These are a great start. I'm going to challenge you today out there to bump it up a notch, though, and take that data and start using things like gauge charts. This is very compelling, particularly if you're making a presentation or you're trying to present some data that will lead to a recommendation that you have in HR around things like turnover, recruiting, retention, training, and development. Give your executives a gauge chart. This shows us here what percentage towards our goal are we on these 4 items with little people. Like a little person, we're getting closer and closer and closer to our goal here in all of these areas. And then the bottom has yet another visual with a gauge that's got red to green. Green means go, green means good. Red means, you know, we're kind of in the danger zone. We're not maybe in training and development here. This tells me we need to maybe put a little bit more attention so we can get to that 100% by the end of the year. So you, HR, have done lots of data gathering behind the scenes. You're tracking the metrics, but you're visualizing it in a way that someone can look quickly and easily and understand we are rocking it on recruiting and we're pretty good in retention, but maybe we need to spend some time in these other areas. An infographic is another great way to do that. This is a quick one on 7 essential recruiting steps, but you could use this for, you know, our 7-step process too. Our 7 steps to successful recruiting are in our organization. Here's what we do, and here's by the numbers. So by the numbers, we get X percentage of hits on our website, and those are, you know, this percentage are qualified, and this percentage then go for an interview, and then we onboard people, and our program's so phenomenal. You know, everybody stays for 5 years, right? I mean, you have to fill in the data, but having something that's visual, using percentages, bringing up the important points, making it succinct. And lastly, I want to share a dashboard. The dashboard is just a great way to pull all of that data together in one place, easy to read. This is just sample fake data, employee turnover. We've got a little circle on the bottom around the reasons for turnover, turnover by manager, turnover by length of service. By having this real-time data, we can start to make some assumptions. We can start to then come up with some of those hypotheses that then we can prove or disprove. Like let's see, it looks like the unspecified manager is having a lot of turnover. Okay, well, you know, what's going on with that? Why is that unspecified? So different ways to really tell your story with the data, much more compelling when you are talking with those executive folks who just want to see the bottom line. So here's an example of what we can do with that. Here's a spreadsheet. This spreadsheet has a lot of information pertinent to recruiting, what's the recruitment is, the date closed, the apps, the days open, you know, lots of information in here. We'll turn that into this. Now we've got a dashboard that I can share with someone that I don't have to, you know, read through the columns and the rows. I can see how many days it takes to fill. We're in the green with that little gauge. I can see that we're in the green. We could probably be better, but we're still within our defined metric that we want to be within. I can see average recruitments per year. Lots of different ways to visually depict this. Now, if we were in the red, I could use this to say, okay, you know, let's devise a strategy to get us out of the red. Okay, I feel like I did want to share that with you. This little link is for you, for folks out there who might be interested in Power BI. For those of you using Microsoft Office, or I think it's Office 365, Microsoft Power BI is a powerful tool to be able to aggregate data, and then it's got little widgets so that you can create different types of visualizations with the data. So one example we use here is tracking where we've done recruiting across the United States. So we've got a nice Power BI graphic of the United States, and then there's a dot in every city where we have done a recruitment, and it's real time. So every time we have another recruitment that we're working on, we get another dot on that real-time map. That's the power of something like BI. So encourage you, if you're interested, to go out. It's an excellent YouTube, quick little tutorial on how to use Power BI. All right, where we went, I don't know about you, but I feel tired. We have gone a long way in this hour. I hope you've taken away at least a couple of nuggets. You know, if you were just really curious about analytics and just were drawn to the webinar because of that, we talked about what that kind of means. We spent more time talking about the importance for HR. It's really important for HR now. It's important to everyone, but HR needs to take more of an evidence-based, more of a data-driven approach to decision-making. And those decisions need to impact into the business units. How are the business units running? They're run by people. Who is taking care of the people? Well, all of us, but certainly HR has a focus around the people. So we are in a prime spot to be able to have a very positive impact in our organization by looking at these data, analyzing the points, applying some analytics, and devising some recommendations for strategies that will help our workforce. We talked about how to get started, dipped our toe in analyzing the data, and then spent a little bit of time on presenting the findings, because that is truly where it all comes together in the end. So I think we've ended just with a couple of minutes so that we have a little bit of time for Q&A.
Okay, so we will get to just a few of the questions that have come in. First one up was, where have predictive HR analytics been helpful?
Okay, well that's a good question, and we touched on a couple of those areas today, Julie. I think particularly in HR we see analytics being applied very effectively to reduce turnover. So to devise strategies for retention. You know, really understanding what is going on with our turnover so that we can devise a strategy so that people will stay and be actively engaged. And that's another area, employee engagement. A lot of the folks we're talking with are doing some sort of employee engagement, employee satisfaction type of data gathering so that they can get a sense of that, of how, again, feeding back into retention. Recruitment is another area. Very, very much encourage you to be looking at your recruitment data so that you can get better at recruiting the right types of candidates and more of them. It's a very tight labor market right now. Recruiting is very difficult, so you want to make sure that your efforts are giving you fruitful candidates. So, and HP had an interesting example that they did. They applied some analytics and came up with a measure of flight risk. So back to retention. Yeah. Okay. So they took a couple of different, 3 or 4 different data points and said this makes someone at higher risk of leaving the organization. So then, if that gets assigned, that information was then shared with the supervisor, who then could do some exploration with that particular employee. And interesting way to apply it.
It is, and it's so important. So next question, though, is software is a key part of tracking this data, and I'm wondering if gathering this info will be based on utilizing HRIS or Excel.
Yeah, I love that question, because HRIS would be fabulous if we all had this super duper HRIS system, but the fact of the matter is that some of those systems can be quite expensive and quite time consuming to implement. And often they come in modules. So maybe you've got one HRIS module, but you don't have the module on training, or you don't have the module on, performance management, right? So you might have pieces of it, but not all of it. So the answer to the question is, you will actually probably be using some run-of-the-mill tools like Excel when you're pulling this data together, and you're going to be using charts and graphs, Power BI. If you're into the statistical packages, if you have those, SPSS, those are good packages to use. Once you get that data out, you've got to analyze it, and very often that is done in a package like Excel. It doesn't have to be hard. I guess what I'm trying to say, it doesn't have to be hard. Use the tools that are at your disposal. And we look at mean, median, and mode, and percentages. So just doing that, applying percentages and looking at mean, median, and mode will be something that you can do within typically, Microsoft Excel. Microsoft Excel has tons of formulas built in as well. And I said it a couple of times, but let me plug pivot tables. Those are great ways to parse data.
Okay, so that does put us at time, and I want to thank you, Melissa. This was such a great presentation. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Again, we will send an email with a link to today's recording and the slide deck. Thank you, and have a great day.